On the program today is Beatles expert, author, writer, producer, and much more. We welcome in Roag Best. Roag, Brian C., thank you so much for being with me on KMET Radio.
Absolute pleasure. I was wondering at what point you were going to take a breath. That was pretty impressive.
Well, we need some energy for this show, Roag, so I appreciate you being here. Roag, you are the half-brother of one of the original Beatles, Pete Best. Can you take us back to how important music meant to you early in your life?
Oh, well, living in our family household, you sort of got weaned on music. You know, it's a very musical house. Our mother was a huge music fan. There was always music playing in the house. So musical tastes are very eclectic, shall we say? Like every kind of music, because for me it's not whether it's jazz, rock and roll, funk, soul, rap. It's whether it's good or whether it's crap. I think it's as easy as that.
Now, Roag, did you play an instrument early in your life, and which instrument was it?
Started playing drums, play a bit of guitar, play a little bit of piano, but drums is my main instrument, and I think that really came about, one, because of my eldest brother Pete, and two, because of one of my younger brothers, Julian. So there was Pete's history as being the original Beatles drummer, so people were always stopping, asking me about Pete, asking me if I played. Then my younger brother had started playing, and then I was just watching all the excitement that was going on around it, a band forming, and thought, oh yeah, I think I'd like to do that. So I picked up the sticks myself when I was about 14 years old.
Now let's talk a little bit about Pete. Pete began with the Beatles, I read, in August 1960, and in '62, your brother was let go of the band.
Yeah.
Where were you when you found out the news? Your reaction to that?
Well, I'm much younger than Pete. I'm the baby brother.
Right.
Yeah. So I can only give you a perspective, as in the family's perspective, and the family's perspective was that it was no one saw it coming. No one really understood the reason why. No proper reason was given at the time. There's been a lot of conjecture since then, and with that conjecture, you know what, Brian, you can say it's this, you can say it's that, you can say it's this, but people have their opinions, and for me, I'm a really laid-back guy. I'm a little bit like, your opinion's your opinion. If that's what you believe, that's okay.
Now, I saw an interview that Pete did a while ago. I think it was with Stern, and I think Stern asked him, why was he let go? Was it because of his looks? And Pete said, no, it wasn't. They just let him go. What can you tell us, during your conversations with Pete, on why does he feel he was let go?
Well, Pete keeps his thoughts to himself, and anyone who's met Pete, he's a really noble guy, and he's not about, bad-mouthing anybody, trying to get behind what happened, but, there's different camps, and there is one camp that, at that time, Pete was the most popular Beatle, believe it or not, but at that time, a lot of people believe he was the most popular Beatle, that it was starting to cause problems within the band, because it's not normally the guy who's sitting at the back on the drums who's getting the attention. And then there's the other things that come up where, hey, he wasn't a good enough drummer. In my opinion, and I know Richie, and Richie's a good drummer, Pete's a good drummer, they've both got different styles. Can Richie do anything that Pete couldn't do? I don't believe so. Can Richie, can Pete do anything that Richie couldn't do? I don't believe so. They're both very competent drummers, both got different styles. I believe they can both do what each other does. Man, it's one of those questions, isn't it? It just boggles the mind to what went on at that time. I think, and this is not taking anything away from Richie, and not taking anything away from Pete. I think they were a very, very young band. Brian Epstein, who was managing them at that point, had hawked the Beatles all around the UK. Well, when I say all around the UK, the whole of the music business at that time was based in London. So he'd literally, gone from door to door in London, hawking the Beatles. They'd been refused. They get this shot with Parlophone, EMI, and the guy, what they didn't understand, and this is actually factual, that at that time Parlophone and a lot of the other companies would have 2 or 3 session drummers that they used on the records. So you could go in, you could have your drummer, and they say that's great, but we're going to use so and so. And in Pete's case, it was like, yeah, that's great, but we might be thinking of using a session guy. I think they panicked. I think this was the last port of call. If it didn't work, they didn't have another direction to go in. I don't think they understood the mechanism. I think they panicked, and that panic, unfortunately, was Pete's undoing, where they dropped Pete. Richie was taken back to London with them, and what happens is he does a session, and they say, no, we're going to use Andy White. At that point, it's like, oh, so this is happening anyway. It's not going to affect the recording contract. What do we do? Well, you've made the decision. You stay with the decision. You don't turn around to the new guy and go, oh, listen, we've totally misunderstood this, so thanks very much, but we're bringing the old guy back in. And how's the old guy going to feel? Is he going to come back in and say, thanks very much, guys? Or is he going to come back in and think, wow, really? 2 years, over 1,000 shows, 27 songs recorded, and the first time the road gets bumpy, this is what happened. Hey, is this going to happen? Do you know what? It would have just been so unsettling. But as history proves, whatever happened, it seems to have been the right thing for the band as a whole, because they became the biggest group in popular music history, and they're still the biggest group in popular music history.
Absolutely, Roag. And one thing that you can never take away in music history is that Pete Best was the original drummer of the Fab Four. So you can never take that away from his history.
No, of course not. There was 5 original. There's only ever been, there's all these like, hey, it was so and so. Was Murray the K the 5th Beatle? No, he wasn't, because he was never in the band. Was Brian Epstein the 5th Beatle? No, he wasn't, because Brian was a manager. He was never in the band. Even though my own father, Neil Aspinall, has been given the title 5th Beatle. Lovely, what a fantastic accolade. But no, he was not the 5th Beatle. He was never in the band. There was only 6 people that were ever in that group as Beatles. And that was John, Paul, George, Stuart, Pete, and Ringo. They're the only 6 guys.
No question. We're talking to legendary Roag Best. Rose, you've had an amazing career yourself. Talk about being the author of the book, The Beatles, The True Beginnings, which became a bestseller. How did that idea develop for you?
Oh, Brian, that was, I love history. I love history. I think by looking back, you can learn a lot of things to take you on your journey forward. Because as we know, we as a human race, we make a lot of the same mistakes over and over again. I'll get off my soapbox now. But I started doing the family's archive. That's all it was. I was writing down the family's history, and a friend of mine came to Liverpool. He worked for Saatchi and Saatchi at the time. Myself and Keith went out drinking, and he said, what are you doing? I said, oh, we're touring, we're doing such and such a country, we're doing that. And he said, oh, yeah. And I said, yeah, then we're going back into studio and we're doing this. He's like, yeah. He said, you're always doing stuff like that. He said, are you up to something that, I don't know about. So I said, well, I've started archiving the family history. I said, it's really, really fun. So he said, have you been writing it down? So I said, yeah. He said, I'd love to see some of that. So I said, okay. I said, well, we'll go back to the house. So we went back to the house, and I got all these notes out and pictures that I'd stapled to pages and whatnot. And Keith sat there for about 30, 40 minutes just reading bits and pieces. And then he looked up and he said, this would make an amazing book, you know. So I said, you think so? He said, yeah. He said, do you mind if I go and get you a book deal? So I said, yeah, sure, go on. So off he went. I didn't give it a second thought. He then called me up about 8 weeks later and said, can you come to, when are you next going to be in London? And I said, well, not for about 6 months. I'm coming to London to watch a Who concert. So he said, can you not get down before then? And I said, no, not really. Why? He said, I've got someone interested in doing the book. So I said, no, I'll come and see them on the afternoon of the Who concert, which I did. I went and saw them, sat with them, and at the end of the meeting, they said, yeah, we want to sign you to do this as a book. So I went, okay. So shook their hands and basically went, well, write to me and I'll give it to my solicitor and we'll start kicking a deal about. And that's how it came about. So something that just started off as fun. As I've said to people before, it started off as a love. It became a labour of love, and towards the end, it just became labour because all of a sudden I was having to hit all these deadlines, which wasn't in the plan and was really stressful at some points. But I got it done, and the book was really, really successful. It became a bestseller for me, so I'm very proud of that.
Yeah, now opening the Casbah Coffee Club, this is where it all truly began for the Beatles, which is now Liverpool's #1 Beatles attraction. Now, that club was started by your mom, is that correct?
Yeah, she watched. She was quite a character, our mother Mo. She was really, really left field. People would say today eccentric. You know, and maybe she was a little bit eccentric, but she was also very forthright and very savvy. And she watched a program called the 6-5 Special, and this TV show was doing a special on the Two Eyes Coffee Bar in London. She saw the Two Eyes Coffee Bar. She saw this music scene that was going on there. The show was talking about the different groups that had been discovered there. Screaming Lord Sutch and the Savages, Marty Wilde and the Wildcats, Cliff Richard and the Shadows. And at the end of the programme, she turned to Johnny Best, that's Pete and Rory's father, and asked him if there was any rock and roll coffee bars in Liverpool. He said there wasn't. She said we should do one in the cellars of the house. Hayman's Green's a really large Victorian mansion. She said, let's change the cellars into a rock and roll coffee bar and put rock and roll groups on. Asked him how he felt about that, and he said, absolutely not. Over my dead body. That's not happening here. The work began the very next day, and it's from the Casbah Coffee Club that the Beatles formed as a group. It's how the guys came together.
Amazing. And now let's talk about the magical Beatles Museum, the world's most authentic Beatles museum, right? And that's on the iconic Matthew Street in Liverpool. Was it your dream to open up a museum, and who was involved in putting that museum together?
Well, basically because of my mother, she was on top of the Casbah Coffee Club. She was Liverpool's first female rock and roll promoter, first music promoter in Liverpool, female music promoter. Obviously, she was a big part of the Beatles in their early days, but she also kept everything. So she built up this huge collection. Then, of course, there's Pete. He was there for 2 years as the Beatles' original drummer. Pete also kept items. And then my dad, Neil Aspinall, he began his time with the Beatles as their roadie. He became their road manager. He eventually became the managing director of Apple Corps. So he did the whole journey with them. And because of the three of them, all these items were coming through the house all the time, and Mo just kept either boxing them up, or if it was too big to box, it was just, you know, basically placed into a corner, and then a room filled, and then another room filled, and then another room filled with all these items, and no one had any interest in this stuff at all except for me. So I ended up being given all this stuff, and ended up with this really rare collection of Beatles memorabilia. Then I got the collector's bug. You know what that's like, Brian, when you get that collector's bug. And
you start seeing those prices, right? And you start seeing some of the prices on some of this stuff. It's remarkable.
Oh well, hey, at that point, I think with anyone who collects, you know, collect because it's a passion and because you love the items. It just happens to be that what I was passionate about and the items I love and was given and also collected close to over a 30-year period now have rocketed in value. So I ended up with this huge collection, and then it reached the point where my wife said to me, you know, this was while the collection was still growing. She said to me, do you intend our house to look like a shrine to the Beatles? And I said, no. And she said, but it really does. I said, yeah, you're right. So I went and got a storage unit, and then, it was one small storage unit, which became 6 small storage units, which became 1 huge storage unit, which became 2 huge storage units, which I've still got. And then I was sitting there thinking, what am I going to do with this? What am I going to do? And this idea of a museum popped into my head. I thought, yeah, I'd really like people to be able to see this. You know, they'd never get an opportunity to see these items. So then that ball was set in motion, but it took 10 years, Brian, because I wanted a building on Matthew Street, as you said, the iconic Matthew Street. It's the epicenter of Liverpool nightlife and also tourism. So really, for me, it had to be there. But because of the nature of that street, it was very, very difficult to get a building. And I got close on 3 occasions. And the 3rd occasion, again, the deal collapsed right at the last minute. Everything on Matthew Street was gone. And I was all crestfallen, forlorn, sad, down, walking across a car park, tears in my eyes. And I bumped into a friend of mine who said, what's up with you? And I said, I've just had to let go of a dream. I said, it's not going to happen. So he said, what's the dream? And I told him. And he said, I didn't know you had that collection. I said, yeah, Dad, don't really tell anybody. So he said, what were you going to say? I was going to do a museum, you know, at Matthew Street. Everything's gone. He said, wow. He said, I've just been offered a building on Matthew Street. I said, when? He said, well, like 15 minutes ago. He said, do you want to buy it? So I said, yeah. He said, oh, come on. He said, I'll walk back into town with you and introduce you to the guy. And it was through that chance meeting in a car park and the introduction that we ended up with our building in Matthew Street.
Unbelievable. I mean, your career is really legendary. Now, you were also the producer of the documentary Best of the Beatles, right? And that broadcasted in 149 countries with a worldwide DVD deal that you did with Warner Brothers. How did that project develop, Roag?
That was, Brian, that was a spin-off from the Beatles, The True Beginnings, the book. I got such great feedback from the book. And then people were saying, hey, you should take this a step further. Have you ever thought of doing a documentary, doing Pete's documentary, doing the early years of the Beatles? And this was all going on round about the time that Beatles were doing the anthology. And I thought, well, let's just wait and see what happens with anthology, because what I didn't want to do was basically, you know, go to all the time and trouble to do, you know, Best of the Beatles, and then anthology comes out and you watch anthology and go, oh, they've covered everything. And but anthology came out and it was sold to the world as the A to Z of the Beatles, and I personally watched it and thought, no, it's not the A to Z, it's most definitely a B to Z. The A's still for the doing. So I did it.
Yeah, now you were also co-writer, as you mentioned, of the Heyman's Green album, which recently re-released this time on green vinyl, which I
Yeah.
read. Yeah, which I read, and this was nominated for 4 Grammy. Can you talk
Yeah.
about that, Roag? And congratulations on that.
Oh, thank you very much. Well, the Grammy nominations were not something we expected. Again, it was just another progression. You know, we'd written the book, we'd we'd done the documentary, we'd cooked the pie, and then we thought, well, why don't we do Pete's story, but through song? You know, Heyman's Green, and do different aspects of his story through songs. And myself and Paul Parry, Philip Melia, Pete was also involved, obviously. Started to write the material for the album, and then we were offered a deal prior to delivering anything, really. And then the company involved, they kept setting. There we go, Brian. They were setting those deadlines again. But what was happening on this occasion? Every time they set a deadline for delivery of the album, we missed the deadline. And in the end, it was about 10 o'clock in the evening for me in the UK. Would have been about 5 p.m. in New York, and the head of their record label phoned me up and he said, "Can I ask you something?" So I said, yeah. He said, "It's been playing on my mind." And I said, "What's that?" He said, "The only time," he said, "we've had a group that hasn't been delivered on time to the extent that you haven't delivered on time was when we were dealing with Bob Marley's Children. And the reason was they had their own recording studio and they just couldn't stop tinkering with the songs." So he said, "Do you have your own recording studio?" And I said, "Yes, we do." And he went, "Ah, so it's not costing you guys fortunes, is it?" And I said, "No, because we've already got our own recording studio." And he said, "Right, well, that explains it, but this is your this is your final deadline." So, and that deadline we did hit.
Unbelievable. Now, you also toured the world as a musician. Can you talk about, this is a tough question, Roag, can you talk about the best concert you were ever involved with?
Do you know what? We've done some fantastic shows with Pete, some really, really big shows. You know, we've played and this isn't favourite shows I'm spitting out here, Brian, because I wouldn't offend anybody by saying favourite shows. This is shows that are just jump into mind. So big shows, you're talking like the Georgia Dome, the Levitt Shell in Memphis. We've done some huge festivals out in the States. We've done huge festivals out in Brazil, out in Argentina. We've done a lot of huge shows. But my favourite shows have been those little intimate club dates of like 200-300 people. And to give you an example of this, when we went out and did the Levitt Shell in Memphis, and I think that one was, and I'm going from memory here, so it's not that capacity, it's bigger, it's smaller, I don't know, I'm just going from memory. I think it's about 25,000 people. And we did that show, and the band went down terrifically. It was a really, really great night, and what a fantastic buzz. But the night before, we'd been drinking in this little Irish bar, and the guy who owned the bar was a fantastic host. He got us all very, very drunk, and he said, "Guys," he said, "are you still in town the day after the Levitt show?" And we said, "Yeah." He said, "If I hire a back line in and a PA, what's the chances of you just landing up the following night and doing this impromptu show?" And we said, "There's really no chance of us doing that." And then the drinks flow, more drinks. "Guys, what? Any further thoughts?" Well, we could have. We don't. Yeah. By 4 o'clock in the morning, we're going to be there. We'll be there at 8 o'clock. We're going to do this impromptu show, and we landed up the day after the Levitt Shell to this tiny boozer pub, held, I don't know, 200, maybe 220 people. There was no stage wear, there was no this. Everyone's just in jeans and torn jeans, trainees, discoloured T-shirts, that favourite T-shirt. Yeah, and we played this little bar, and it was electric. And we didn't really do the show. We were just pulling numbers out of the air that we'd all played at different times in our career, and we're going, do you know this? Yep, let's go. And that's been one of my favourite all-time shows, a little tiny pub in Memphis.
And they're telling me I have 1 minute left, Roag. My last question, just out of curiosity, do you and Pete ever communicate with Paul McCartney, or you guys went your separate ways? Long time ago.
Yeah, Pete hasn't spoken to Paul since 1962. I still speak to Paul, so it's a bit of a weird one that. Pete doesn't speak to him, I do speak to him.
And do you have a website that our audience can go onto and check out your book, check out your museum? You're welcome. You have the floor. Go right ahead.
Come and check out. There's two. You can come and www.petebest.com or www.magicalbeatlesmuseum.com. Both are really good websites. Both have got lots of news. And if you're ever in Liverpool, come and see us. And if you don't come and see us, we'll come and see you. We're touring in the USA next year. You're the first radio show that's got that news. We're touring in the States. October
all right.
Next year. We're going right across the USA.
It's excellent. Listen, I appreciate a few minutes. Thank you so much, and give my best to Pete. Okay, Roag?
Brian, thanks to you, and thanks to everyone involved with the show, and a big thank you to your listeners. Without them, you'd be sitting at home now, and so would I.
Thank you so much, and take care of yourself.
Cheers, Brian. All the best.
You too. That was legendary Roag Best, half-brother of Pete Best, one of the Beatles originals. Until next week, happy collecting to all.